Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're diving into the intricate world of biology, but not just focusing on the individual pieces. We're going beyond the nuts and bolts, taking a systems-level approach to understanding the beautiful complexity of life.
Exactly. It's like appreciating a symphony, not just for the individual instruments, but for how they harmonize to create something much greater than the sum of their parts.
I like that analogy. So what exactly is this systems biology approach? And how is it different from the way we traditionally study biology?
Well, for a long time, biology was very reductionist. We'd break down organisms into their smallest components, study those in isolation, and try to extrapolate back up. But that approach has limitations. It's like trying to understand a city by only studying individual bricks.
Ah, I see. You missed the bigger picture. The interactions and the emergent properties that arise from those interactions.
Precisely. Systems biology acknowledges those interactions. It looks at the network's feedback loops and interconnectedness of all the parts.
Okay, so instead of just focusing on the what systems biology, helps us understand the how and the why things work the way they do.
Absolutely. And to illustrate this, let's take a deep dive, literally into the human respiratory system.
Perfect. We all breathe. But I bet most of us don't really think about the intricate processes happening under the hood. It's kind of like a car. We know how to drive it, but we don't necessarily understand the mechanics that make it go.
Great analogy. And just like a car has different systems working together, so does our respiratory system. We have airways, muscles, blood vessels, and specialized cells all playing their part.
So where do we start with this intricate machinery? Let's break down the respiratory system piece by piece.
Let's begin our journey with the airways. Think of them as a network of passageways guiding air into the lungs. It starts with the nostrils and nasal cavity, filtering, warming, and moistening the air we breathe.
Makes sense. So it's not just about getting air in. It's about preparing that air for its journey into the lungs.
Exactly. Then the air travels down through the pharynx, past the larynx, and into the trachea, which branches into two bronchi, each leading to a lung.
Okay, following the pathway so far. So we've got the air in the lungs. Now what?
This is where the magic of gas exchange happens. Deep within the lungs, the bronchi branch further into a delicate network of bronchioles. These tiny airways eventually lead to the alveoli, millions of microscopic air sacs that resemble clusters of grapes.
Alveoli, I remember those from biology class. They're where oxygen enters the blood and carbon dioxide leaves, right?
Spot on. And what's fascinating is that the alveoli are incredibly thin-walled, creating an enormous surface area for efficient gas exchange. Think of it like maximizing contact between air and blood.
It's like having a super thin membrane separating the air we breathe from the vast network of capillaries that carry our blood. So how does this gas exchange actually work? Is it some kind of active transport system?
It's actually much simpler and more elegant than that. It all boils down to diffusion, the natural movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area low concentration.
Ah, so it's like a balancing act. Oxygen is more concentrated in the alveoli, so it diffuses into the blood, while carbon dioxide, more concentrated in the blood, moves into the alveoli to be exhaled. Makes perfect sense.
Exactly. But it's not just about diffusion, it's also about the unique properties of the gases themselves. Carbon dioxide, for example, is much more soluble in blood than oxygen.
So even though the pressure difference for carbon dioxide might be smaller, its solubility allows it to diffuse efficiently across that alveolar membrane. Interesting. But how does the air get in and out of the lungs in the first place?
That's where the mechanics of breathing come in. This beautifully coordinated process involves the diaphragm, a dome-shaped muscle beneath the lungs, and the intercostal muscles that run between the ribs.
Okay, so this is where the action happens. What do these muscles do?
When we inhale, the diaphragm contracts, flattening and pulling downward. Simultaneously, the intercostal muscles contract, lifting the rib cage up and out. These actions increase the volume of the chest cavity, creating lower air pressure inside the lungs compared to the outside air.
So air rushes in to equalize the pressure. It's like creating a vacuum, drawing air into the lungs. Clever. And what about exhaling?
Exhaling is mostly passive. The diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax, the chest cavity decreases in volume, and the lungs recoil, pushing air out. Of course, we can also force air out, like when we're blowing out candles or exercising vigorously.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, I've heard terms like tidal volume and vital capacity when talking about breathing. What do those mean?
These terms describe different volumes of air involved in breathing. Tidal volume is the amount of air inhaled and exhaled during normal, relaxed breathing. Think of it as your everyday breath.
Right, makes sense. And vital capacity?
Vital capacity is the maximum amount of air you can exhale after taking the deepest breath possible. It's a measure of your lung capacity.
So like a deep cleansing breath. And I bet those measurements are useful for doctors, right?
Absolutely. Spirometers are devices that measure these lung volumes and capacities. They're incredibly helpful in diagnosing and monitoring respiratory problems.
So we've talked about the airways, the mechanics of breathing, and these different lung volumes, but we can't forget about the vital role of blood in this whole process.
You're absolutely right. The blood is the transportation system carrying oxygen from the lungs to the tissues and carbon dioxide back to the lungs to be exhaled. And this is where things get really interesting.
I love when things get interesting. Tell me more.
Well, you see, most of the oxygen in our blood doesn't just float around freely. It hitches a ride on a special protein found in red blood cells called hemoglobin.
Hemoglobin. Okay, I've definitely heard of that.
Mm.
It's what gives blood its red color, right?
That's right. But more importantly, hemoglobin has this incredible ability to bind to oxygen, forming oxyhemoglobin.
So it's like hemoglobin is a fleet of tiny taxis picking up oxygen passengers from the lungs and delivering them to the tissues throughout the body.
I love that analogy. You've got it exactly right.
This is fascinating. But what about carbon dioxide? Does it get its own special transport system?
Carbon dioxide is a bit more versatile in its travel arrangements. Some of it dissolves directly into the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Another portion binds to hemoglobin, forming carbaminohemoglobin.
Okay, so it can hitch a ride on hemoglobin too, but not in the same way as oxygen. Interesting. Is there another way it travels?
There is, and this is where it gets really fascinating. The majority of carbon dioxide actually travels in the form of bicarbonate ions.
Bicarbonate ions. That sounds a bit more complex. How does that work?
Well, inside red blood cells, there's this enzyme called carbonic anhydrase.
Hold on, an enzyme. Now we're getting into some serious chemistry. What does this enzyme do?
Carbonic anhydrase is like a super efficient catalyst. It speeds up the reaction between carbon dioxide and water forming carbonic acid, which then quickly dissociates into bicarbonate ions.
Wow, that's some impressive chemistry. And these bicarbonate ions, what happens to them?
They're released into the plasma and transported to the lungs, where they're converted back into carbon dioxide for exhalation.
Huh.
It's a remarkably efficient system.
Okay, so we've got oxygen and carbon dioxide moving in and out of the lungs, transported by the blood. It's like a beautifully choreographed dance. But who's the choreographer? Who's controlling our breathing, making sure we're breathing at the right rate and depth?
That's where our brain comes in. Specifically, a region in the brainstem called the medulla oblongata. It's the control center for many vital functions, including breathing.
The medulla oblongata. Sounds a bit intimidating. What's going on in there?
Within the medulla is the respiratory rhythm center, which generates nerve impulses that control the muscles involved in breathing. Think of it as our internal pacemaker for breathing, setting the tempo for inhalation and exhalation.
So it's constantly sending signals to those respiratory muscles, telling them when to contract and relax. But how does it know how fast or slow to make us breathe?
That's the remarkable part. Our bodies are incredibly good at sensing and responding to changes in our internal environment. There are chemosensitive areas within the brainstem that are extremely sensitive to changes in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration in the blood.
Okay, so if carbon dioxide levels rise like during exercise, these chemosensitive areas detect that change. What happens then?
They send signals to the respiratory rhythm center, prompting it to increase the rate and depth of breathing, to expel the excess carbon dioxide and restore balance. It's a brilliant feedback mechanism.
Wow, so our brains are constantly monitoring our blood and adjusting our breathing to keep things running smoothly. It's like having an internal thermostat, but for gases instead of temperature.
Exactly. And there's another layer of control, too.
Wait, there's more. Tell me.
The aortic arch and carotid arteries, major blood vessels, also contain special receptors that are sensitive to changes in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration. They act as a backup system, sending signals to the respiratory center if needed.
So it's like having a double-check mechanism to make sure we're breathing properly. Pretty amazing. But what about oxygen? Doesn't it play a role in regulating breathing too?
You might think so, but surprisingly, oxygen plays a relatively minor role. Our bodies are primarily driven to get rid of carbon dioxide. Not necessarily to take in more oxygen. As long as we're breathing normally, our blood oxygen levels stay pretty stable.
That's really interesting. I would have thought oxygen was the key player in the breathing game. But it makes sense that carbon dioxide is the real driving force, since it's a waste product that needs to be removed.
Exactly. And this highlights a key principle of systems biology, understanding the feedback loops and how different components influence each other.
This is also fascinating. I'm already starting to see how this systems approach can give us a much deeper understanding of how the body works.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more to explore, from the intricacies of gas transport to the complexities of respiratory disorders.
Well, I'm definitely eager to learn more. Let's pick up right here next time, and we'll dive back in to explore these other fascinating aspects of the respiratory system.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
Okay, so last time we were talking about how our brains control our breathing, responding to changes in carbon dioxide levels. It's amazing how our bodies can maintain this delicate balance without us even having to think about it. But what happens when that balance is disrupted? What are some of the things that can go wrong with the respiratory system?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, there are a number of respiratory disorders that can interfere with normal breathing and gas exchange. Some are acute, like pneumonia, while others are chronic, like asthma or emphysema.
Okay, so let's start with asthma. I know it's a very common condition, especially in children. What exactly is happening in the lungs when someone has an asthma attack?
Asthma is characterized by inflammation and narrowing of the airways, making it difficult for air to move in and out of the lungs. Imagine those airways, the bronchi and bronchioles, constricting like someone is squeezing them tight.
So instead of being nice and open for airflow, they become restricted, making it harder to breathe. That sounds really uncomfortable. What triggers these asthma attacks?
Well, triggers can vary from person to person, but common ones include allergens like pollen dust mites and pet dander, as well as irritants like smoke, air pollution, and even cold air. Exercise can also be a trigger for some people.
So it's like the airways become hypersensitive,
Ugh.
overreacting to these triggers and causing that inflammation and constriction. And I imagine this can lead to some pretty scary symptoms.
Absolutely. Calming symptoms include wheezing, coughing, shortness of breath, and tightness in the chest. It can feel like you're suffocating.
That sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
What can people do to manage their asthma and prevent these attacks?
There are a number of effective treatments available, including medications like bronchodilators to open up the airways and inhaled corticosteroids to reduce inflammation. Identifying and avoiding triggers is also crucial.
So it sounds like a combination of medication and lifestyle changes can make a big difference for people with asthma. Now, you mentioned emphysema earlier. I know that's a serious lung disease often linked to smoking. What's happening in the lungs with emphysema?
Emphysema is a chronic condition where the alveoli, those tiny air sacs we talked about earlier, become damaged and lose their elasticity. Remember how we compared them to tiny balloons? Well, with emphysema, those balloons become stiff and can't inflate and deflate properly.
So the lungs lose their ability to efficiently exchange gases. I can see how that would lead to serious breathing problems.
Exactly. And unfortunately, the damage to the alveoli is irreversible. This is why emphysema is such a debilitating disease. The main symptom is shortness of breath, even at rest.
It must be incredibly difficult for people with emphysema to do everyday activities. I imagine it also puts a lot of strain on the heart.
You're right. The heart has to work much harder to pump blood through the damaged lungs, which can lead to heart problems over time.
This is all sounding pretty grim. Is there anything that can be done to slow the progression of emphysema?
The most important thing is to stop smoking. That's the #1 risk factor for emphysema. Other treatments focus on managing symptoms and improving quality of life.
Okay, so quitting smoking is absolutely essential. It's a powerful reminder of just how much our lifestyle choices can impact our lung health.
Absolutely. And it's not just smoking. Exposure to air pollution, both indoors and outdoors, can also contribute to respiratory problems.
Right. It's like we're constantly breathing in a cocktail of pollutants, from car exhaust to industrial emissions. That can't be good for our lungs.
It's definitely something to be aware of. Protecting our lungs means not just avoiding smoking, but also being mindful of air quality and taking steps to reduce our exposure to pollutants.
So wear a mask on those smoggy days, invest in an air purifier for your home, and maybe even advocate for cleaner air policies.
Exactly. It's about taking a proactive approach to respiratory health.
Well, I'm definitely feeling motivated to take a deep breath of fresh air after this conversation. But before we wrap up our discussion of the respiratory system, I want to circle back to this idea of systems biology. We focused on one system in detail, but I'm curious to explore how this approach is being applied more broadly in scientific research.
That's a great point. The beauty of systems biology is that it can be applied to any biological system, from the molecular level to the ecosystem level.
Okay, so give me some examples. How is systems biology changing the way scientists are studying life?
One exciting area is in understanding the complex interactions between different systems in the body. For example, scientists are using systems biology to study the gut microbiome and its influence on everything from digestion to immunity to mental health.
The gut microbiome. That's a hot topic these days.
Oh,
It's fascinating to think that trillions of bacteria living in our gut can have such a profound impact on our overall health.
It really is, and systems biology is giving us the tools to start unraveling those complex interactions. Another area where systems biology is making waves is in drug discovery.
Okay, how so?
Traditionally, drug development has focused on targeting specific molecules or pathways. But with a systems approach, scientists can look at the bigger picture, considering how a drug might affect multiple pathways and systems.
So instead of just looking for a magic bullet that hits one target, we're thinking about how a drug might interact with the entire network. That's a much more holistic approach.
Exactly. It's about understanding the interconnectedness of things and using that knowledge to develop more effective and targeted therapies.
It sounds like systems biology is opening up a whole new frontier in medicine. What are some other exciting areas of research?
Well, scientists are also using systems biology to study cancer, infectious diseases, and even aging. By understanding the complex networks involved in these processes, we can develop new strategies for prevention, diagnosis, and treatment.
Wow, the possibilities seem endless. It sounds like systems biology is going to revolutionize the way we understand and treat disease.
I think it has the potential to do just that. It's a rapidly evolving field with so much promise.
I'm definitely feeling inspired by this conversation. It's so exciting to see how science is pushing the boundaries of knowledge and leading to new breakthroughs. But I have to admit, my brain is starting to feel a bit overloaded with all this information.
I understand. It's a lot to take in. But what's important to remember is that systems biology is not about memorizing every detail. It's about appreciating the interconnectedness of life and embracing the complexity.
That's a great point. It's about seeing the forest for the trees, understanding how all those individual parts contribute to the beauty and resilience of the whole.
Exactly. And that understanding can inspire us to take better care of ourselves and our environment and all those intricate systems that support life on Earth.
I love that perspective. It's a reminder that we're all part of something much bigger than ourselves. But before we get too philosophical, I want to make sure our listeners walk away with some practical takeaways. What are some key things people should remember about the respiratory system?
Well, first and foremost, appreciate your lungs. They're constantly working to keep you alive, even when you're not thinking about it.
Well, first and foremost, appreciate your lungs. They're constantly working to keep you alive, even when you're not thinking about it.
It's true. Breathing is something we often take for granted, but it's a pretty amazing feat of biological engineering.
What else should we keep in mind?
Another important point is that the respiratory system doesn't work in isolation. It's intimately connected to other systems in the body, especially the circulatory system.
Right. It's like a tag team effort to deliver oxygen to every cell and remove carbon dioxide. They're the ultimate dynamic duo.
And finally, remember that your lifestyle choices can have a big impact on your respiratory health. Avoiding smoking, staying active, and being aware of air quality can help protect your lungs and keep them functioning optimally.
So eat your veggies, get some exercise, and don't smoke. Got it. But I have one last question for you. We've talked a lot about the human respiratory system, but do other animals breathe in the same way?
That's a great question. While the basic principles of gas exchange are similar across the animal kingdom, the specific mechanisms of breathing can vary quite a bit.
Okay, give me some examples. I'm curious to know how other creatures get their oxygen.
Well, fish, for example, use gills to extract oxygen from the water. Gills are specialized structures with a large surface area that allow for efficient diffusion of oxygen into the bloodstream.
So it's kind of like the alveoli in our lungs, but adapted for an aquatic environment.
Exactly. And insects have a completely different system. They have a network of tubes called tracheae that deliver oxygen directly to their tissues, bypassing the circulatory system altogether.
Wow, that's so cool. It's like having a built-in oxygen delivery system right to the cells.
It's a remarkably efficient system for small organisms, allowing them to be incredibly active despite their size.
This is blowing my mind. It's incredible to see how evolution has come up with such diverse solutions to the same fundamental challenge, breathing.
It really is a testament to the power of natural selection. Each species has evolved a respiratory system that is perfectly suited to its environment and lifestyle.
So while we humans might take our lungs for granted, it's clear that breathing is a remarkable feat of biological engineering that has taken many forms throughout evolutionary history.
And that's precisely the beauty of studying biology from a systems perspective.
Yeah.
It allows us to appreciate not just the individual parts, but how they integrate, adapt, and function as a whole.
Well, I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about today. We've explored the human respiratory system in detail, delved into the fascinating world of comparative respiratory anatomy, and highlighted how systems biology is transforming our understanding of life itself.
It's been a true deep dive into the wonders of breathing and the interconnectedness of biological systems.
So next time you take a breath, remember the incredible journey happening inside you and the millions of years of evolution that have made it possible.
And keep exploring. There's a whole universe of fascinating discoveries waiting to be made right inside your own body and in the natural world around you.
Until next time, deep divers, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep breathing.